It wasn't always kind of something that I thought of when it's like, oh, I have to introduce myself to somebody new and they might look at me and say, why don't you look like your parents? It was in those kinds of moments that I started to realize that the world had different expectations of me than I had of myself.
Adoption is one of the paths to parenthood that we often refer to in the infertility community. On this show, we've produced several episodes about adoption from different perspectives, episodes featuring leaders from national nonprofit organizations who help families adopt. We featured adoptive parents who've shared their experiences with adoption. But one perspective that needs to be heard in any conversation about adoption is perhaps the most important perspective of all. It's the perspective of those who've been adopted themselves. Today, we're going to hear from my good friend, Jessica Luciere. She's going to share her experiences as a transracial and transnational adopted person, and she's going to share some of the expertise that she picked up in her years working as a program facilitator and adoptee advocate. I'm Dan Bulger, and this is Infertility. Hi everyone. Before we dive in, I just want to take a second to remind you that we have some resources available for anyone who might want to bring fertility and family benefits to their employer at progyny.com/talk-to-HR. Most employers that offer these benefits, including adoption reimbursement and support services, do so because an employee asked for it. So take advantage of our resources and help bring this life-changing benefit to your employer. Now, I am extremely excited for today's episode. Transracial adoption has kind of been a theme that's been running in the background of my life since I was a kid. My parents were foster parents throughout my life. Over time, they helped over 100 kids before they retired. My younger brother was adopted through that program. And I remember being a kid living in Levittown, New York, and feeling like I had a different family life than my friends and neighbors. For me, it was always a source of pride. I thought, and I still think, that my parents are heroes, and while there are moments here or there where racism and discrimination would rear its head, for me, growing up this way was just a small difference that I had to others. So, as I said, for me, transracial adoption has always kind of been present in my life, but of course, I wasn't experiencing much of it firsthand. And what's cool is that today's guest, Jessica, also grew up at the same time in Levittown, New York, in a family that was different from her friends and neighbors. We didn't know each other when we were kids, but now we're actually close friends as we met through my wife, Cassandra. Hi, Cassandra. Later, when we were teenagers. While my experience and Jessica's experience are very, very different, I realized that she and I never really spent any time discussing the parts that cross over. Well, that is, until we started producing this episode. And I have to say, I've learned a lot. So let's get to know Jessica.
I'm Jessica Luciere. I am a transracial, transnational adopted person who was born in Bogota, Colombia. I grew up in New York, and I have been lucky enough to work in spaces that provide programming and services for adopted people and their families for many years now. My parents had been married for, I think, about 7 or 8 years at the time, and got pregnant and had, my mother had gotten sick while she was pregnant. And this was back in the late 70s when I guess there weren't probably as many preventative services around or enough people to kind of tell them what was going on. And it all happened pretty fast. So it caused her to deliver early. And then unfortunately their daughter had only, I think she only lived for about 2 weeks. And I know I can speak to, knowing that how difficult it was. She was always a conversation in our home, and the time and the experience was not always part of our conversation because I can only imagine how difficult that would be. But I always knew about Stephanie, and I think, them always wanting to continue and build a family and have a child. And having the opportunity to adopt from Colombia, it was a bigger country in the early 80s, that had a lot of people coming internationally to adopt. Growing up, I grew up in Levittown in New York on Long Island, and I was an only child in a family with 2 parents who were Italian American. And growing up in Levittown, especially in the 80s and 90s, there weren't many mirrors for me as a person of color, although I can say I probably identified as a person of color when I was younger, or as an adopted person. There weren't any other adopted people that I knew of who were in my immediate area, in my school, my teachers, anybody who was, having kind of close contact with me. It was tough to understand from a young person's perspective, kind of why I would walk into a room and some people with my parents and some people would look at me and kind of try to figure us out a little bit more. It didn't, as a person who's growing up, I joined my family at 3 months. So my parents are my parents. They are the people that I've known my whole life. And of course, I knew that there was difference. I knew that, that I had been born somewhere else. They were always very open and honest with me about that, which I'm very thankful for. But as much as I knew that, I can't say that it was ever always on my mind when going into new spaces. Or it wasn't always kind of something that I thought of when it's like, oh, I have to introduce myself to somebody new and they might look at me and say, why don't you look like your parents? It was in those kinds of moments that I started to realize that the world had different expectations of me than I had of myself. And they saw me differently. People would speak to me in a different language. They would look for my parents if I was with my parents, not assuming that we were together. And it's all of these kinds of experiences that we have as adopted people, especially those of us who are transracial, that are those first kind of moments of realizing there's difference and people are looking at my family a little bit different. And so, I saw my parents navigate through those situations. I saw how they also gave privacy to our family and didn't always answer invasive questions when they came. And they were the ones who kind of taught me how to be a person in this family and eventually how to be my own person who was not always beside my parents and facing people who were going to still have these ideas of who they think I should be based on how I look.
Jessica shared with me that growing up, she never would have imagined a career that was in any way connected to her background as an adopted person. But I think just listening to Jessica speak about her experiences and just knowing who she is, I really can't think of a better person to work as an advocate and a program manager in the adoption community.
I was always kind of looking for myself and other people and not having those mirrors, not having mentors, not having an example of what it could look like to grow as an adopted person and live and kind of claim this part of my identity. And also just be a person out in the world doing things. And so when the opportunities came my way by people who then became my mentors to become a mentor, to give that representation to other adopted people, to be there in service for, helping to uplift the voice of adopted people by also talking to adoptive parents and professionals, it felt very natural and I felt empowered. I had never imagined that my story and that my experiences could be helpful to other people. Because as adopted people, we tend to just feel as though our experiences are our own. And, you can feel very kind of lonely in your experience. And it wasn't until I was given a platform to speak on panels, to be a part of trainings, again, to become a mentor, that I realized, oh, wow, the things that I have gone through help to also give some light to other people who might be going through some things, and for kids who are on their way to bigger moments of identity formation in their lives.
Jessica does a lot of work in the community, and part of her role is to run identity trainings. It's a requirement that adoptive families go through many trainings prior to adopting a child, and identity training is an important piece. We need to understand that when we're adopting children, we're adopting people. Children grow up, and identity becomes increasingly important as we start to learn who we are.
We talk about the importance of having representation of your child's, background, whether it be, their racial background, their cultural background, kind of integrated into the family before the child joins their family. It helps to make the family feel as though it's not just, parents adopting from this country that they may not have a connection with other than having their child from there. It's kind of folding those things in, understanding the importance of, what identity formation looks like for all people, but especially for those of us who come from different places. Even if it's not another country, it's another state, there's another cultural background that's associated with your child than you may have in your home. folding those things into your family and kind of adopting that along with your child. You get to grow into that culture with them, when they're kind of looking back and they're looking at their life and saying, I can tell you right now, I never had Colombian food until I was 18 years old. And that's a crime because Colombian food is amazing. My parents probably would have never thought to, number one, look for Colombian food, think that could be something that could be a bonding moment for us, not only for us as a family, but for them with culture, with this culture that I come from. And, it's these small things that we can kind of put in place very naturally to really make the family feel like a safe space so that when these conversations do come up, there's already recognition like, oh, yeah, we're an Italian family. We're an Italian-Colombian family because our child is born in Colombia. I think it's, having those conversations more specifically with adoptive parents and pre-adoptive parents who are kind of on their way to adoption, talking about how important these small kind of intricacies are. Because, we know that when you're in the adoption process, there's so many things that you're kind of juggling and anticipating and waiting for. These are the kinds of things that you can start to do to, incorporate, if you know that where you're adopting from, pieces of that culture. So you make your family and you make your home a welcoming and comforting place for the child to come home to, even if they're babies. They grow up seeing the things that represent where they come from on their walls, and it's just as regular as reading books about, diverse families or the country that they may have been born from.
Food is a great example. I mean, in general, I think we all benefit from exposing ourselves to different foods. As Jessica said, Colombian food is extraordinary and no one should grow up without it. But there are a lot of examples of other important cultural aspects that adoptive parents really should make an effort to incorporate. And perhaps none more important than language.
I remember for me not having spoken Spanish, like I never had Spanish represented in my life. And I remember a cousin of mine took Spanish in college and would come to my house, every once in a while because she was living in Europe, and she would come and she would teach me Spanish. And she was, she's German, but she was my representation. She was that opportunity for me when I was in the supermarket, and somebody might have asked me a question in Spanish. I could pull from that experience and say, okay, I know a little bit. I know how to say hola, I had a little bit of a tie, and that meant the world to me because I can remember those memories so vividly of having her come home from college and being away in Europe and kind of teaching me without realizing that she was really teaching me. It's things like that when you think about the importance of language also. People who are adopted, and especially those of us transnational adoptees, tend to kind of find a tie at some point in their lives to their birth culture, to their country. And usually it's the language, it's the food that are those first stepping stones into reclamation of that piece of your identity. And so if that's kind of already embedded in what your family has put in front of you and has given you the opportunity for, and themselves, then it's a little bit less of this kind of huge transition, this readoption of who you were. I would say that, and also, finding community, finding other places where your child finds representation, having mirrors for them in their lives, and having that integrated in very purposefully. Just like you said, it's like going to a salon where they'll see people who look like them. Hair texture, right? Finding a salon that knows how to deal with, their hair texture and knows how to care for them in that way. And you're learning from that. All of these things make a really big difference as a child is growing, to know that their parents are also aware that there are differences that they may not naturally know, that they have to find some support in.
Language is an important piece of identity, but language in a different sense plays a key role here as well. When I first started speaking with Jessica about doing this episode, I made a language mistake that I probably have been making my entire life without even thinking about it. I kept using the term adopted children or adopted kids. Every question I'd ask was set up that way, but Jessica reminded me that this way of describing it is actually doing a disservice to the adopted community. Yes, adopted people are often babies or children at the time that they're adopted, although there are also adopted teenagers to consider. But the point we all need to remember is that these are people. They grow up, they become adults, and when we don't consider their lives as they grow up, we can miss important things. And this is part of the reason that openness from the start is such an important pillar of any adoptive family.
The ability to be open with your child about their story, about what you know, about what you feel is right to share with them, in age appropriate times. That openness really does create such a great foundation for your child to feel as though, which they should, all parents should want to make sure that their child feels that their parents are their safe space. And, they can talk to you about anything. They can come to you with questions. Because my parents had integrated my story very naturally into my life from as long as I can remember, reading books at night, showing me where Colombia was on the map, talking very positively about Colombia, all of those things really made a difference, so that when I was in those years of identity formation between like the ages of 12 to 18 years old, when you start to really see that the world, again, has a different kind of assumption of who you are based on how you look, and you have to make room for that and how you identify yourself. That's a really complex thing to kind of have to navigate and bring home to your parents who may not have had that same kind of experience. But because those conversations of your story, of where you came from, of how you became a family have been kind of embedded in a natural conversation, it makes your parents become these people that, are that they help you through those transitions. So I would say the openness and the willingness to be vulnerable and say, I don't always have all the answers, but I'm happy to, help you find the answers. And I'm happy to go with you to reclaim parts of yourself. My parents had always, they had always been open to the idea that if I had ever wanted to search for birth family, they were like, we support you 100%. We'll do everything we can to help you. And if you want us to be there, we'll be there for you. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for them to say. But they said it so naturally because they wanted to make sure that I knew that every step of the way, at no matter when it would happen, they were going to be there. So I think it's really all of those, those things that you can do at home very naturally as parents want to love their kids and take care of them and make sure that they're safe, for those who are adopted, and especially those who might not look like their parents. All of those things are really important to make sure that your child really feels seen and loved and like acknowledged as a person who came from somewhere else.
Right now, there's a kid in a town somewhere, maybe it's even Levittown, who feels like they're different. They're different from their friends, and they feel that they're somehow different from their family as well. Jessica experienced that feeling firsthand growing up, and through her life and her work, she's discovered that one of the best ways through that feeling is community.
That feeling of kind of loneliness and that feeling of this is my own experience. I'm the only one to feel these things. I'm the only one to think these thoughts or to ask these questions. When you are able to find community and find that you're not the only one, there's a lot of people out there that have had a lot of the same questions, that have gone through very similar things that you may go through. They have thought things that you might have thought and kind of pushed back in the back of your mind and said, this is just me. I can't say this out loud because this might be too hurtful. It might be too scary to say. When you find that community and when you're able to talk about your experiences and how you feel, it's empowering. It's an important space for growth. It's an important space to find your mirrors, and it's an important place to see what, that the path that you're kind of going down, as windy as it may be, might not be so dark and scary because you're allowing for yourself to find people who share the same experiences or similar ones.
Community is important for all of us, but sometimes it can be hard for an adopted person to find that community that really feels right. Fortunately, there are lots of resources out there that can help.
There are so many different groups that are adoptee-led, adoptee-created. I think anything is just kind of an easy Google search away. It's like if you're looking for a specific community, sometimes families say, oh, my son was born in Colombia. I really want to find other Colombians. I've been a part of, these kind of homegrown groups that have been very Colombian adoptee-centered for many years now. When there are families who are looking for resources where there's a parent focus on it, finding something like a mentorship program. Sometimes there are mentorship programs that are attached to adoption agencies. I can say Spence Chapin has a very robust post-placement program department that serves families from placement through adulthood with programming. And that's a space for everyone. I think what's really wonderful is that Unfortunately, COVID was not a time that we like to look back on with, finding the positives necessarily, but we do have to look for the positives in that time. And I can say finding so much community and having so many adopted people create spaces where so many people found each other and were connected and were, in this space of being home alone and not having, much resource and connection with the outside world, and then seeing as many spaces that were created. And people finding their voice and people finding their communities and seeing those spaces continue. I have been a part of so many groups where I find different groups of adopted people. There's different subjects of conversation. Some might be focused in on a culture. Some might be focused in on an experience. The wonderful thing I think is also that for those of us who are adopted people doing this work and kind of being able to create programming and spaces for adopted people and their families, we are able to include the families on that. So creating resources for families too, where we're talking about, the complexities of being parents to adopted children or being adoptive parents, just the challenges of parenting also. We can focus the lens in on adoption, but sometimes it's just talking about the broader scale of just being a parent, to kids who are growing their identity.
Jessica really throws herself into her work. Every day, she chooses to show up for the adopted communities in ways that truly make a difference.
Every person's story changes my own narrative. Everything that I know about adoption or everything that I know about my own experience changes when I talk to somebody else and I hear what their experience was like. I hear about how they navigated things that I might have navigated. And I will never hear something that I'm like, I've heard that before. Regardless of how different our experiences are, regardless of how different our beginnings were, those stories are what keeps me doing this work. It keeps me thinking about how we can create more programming and create more spaces to uplift adopted people and their voices, to make sure that we're centering the adopted person. And it brings me joy every single day. I think about how much it would have made a difference to me as a young person to hear some of the conversations that we have in mentorship or some of the other programming that I run, and I can see the healing that it's doing for our younger generation and for their parents. So that's the joy.
I hope that you got something from this episode. I hope anyone thinking of adopting who's listening can take this and run with it. All those trainings that you have to do in preparation sometimes can feel like hurdles, but you need to understand. These aren't hurdles, these are opportunities. That person that you're going to adopt needs and deserves this connection, and you, as their parent, are going to be their safe space. So, if you're going in, dive in. Soak up as much as you can, incorporate their culture, learn the tools you need to succeed, and when the time comes, practice openness. And if you ever need a hand, there are plenty of people like Jessica out there who can lend you one. I want to thank Jessica for sharing her experience with us here today. Jessica really is one of my closest friends, and I'm so happy that we got to do this together. And I want to thank you for listening. Remember, the purpose of stories like this isn't to give you a blueprint on how you can build your family, but rather to give you comfort in knowing that you really aren't alone in this journey. There are a lot of people out there who are going through their own journeys. And while not all endings are the same, we hope you can take some solace in knowing that there are options out there for support. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to connect with us, you can do so on Instagram at This Is a Fertility Podcast. If you want to follow Progyny, you can do that at Progyny Inc. Of course, if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating and review. And if you're on YouTube, please like and subscribe. This Is Infertility is brought to you by Progyny. Please remember, this podcast is not intended to substitute for the personalized expert advice of your physician. I'm Dan Bulger, and this is Infertility.